Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this virtual session with the German American Heritage Foundation and Museum. My name is Katja Sippel. I'm the Executive Director, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Paul Glenshaw this morning. He is a documentary filmmaker, a true Renaissance man, an artist, an art historian, and he is, as I already said, a filmmaker who is in the process of creating a documentary on German-American artist Emanuel Leutze, whose famous painting, Washington Crossing the Delaware, is probably well known by everyone listening and watching today, but it hides a few secrets, and that's what Paul will share with us today.
Indeed. Well, I'm delighted to be with you today and to share this story with you. And as Katja said, I'm a filmmaker and working on this television series called Art Plus History, which came out of a series I did for the Smithsonian Institution that looks at these iconic works of art and the whole historical story behind them. How did they actually come to be, and what's the story actually being told? So that's, and Washington Crossing the Delaware is certainly this great icon of American history, but it has very strong German American history behind it. And that's what we'll be exploring today. The actual story of what happened with George Washington himself, why he crossed the Delaware, but then why was it that this artist, Emanuel Leutze, came to paint it? Who was he? And why was he the guy to do it? And when did he do it and where? Just answering those questions brings us this really fascinating context. So what I'd like to do to start, though, is to show you a very brief teaser for the television series, which we're beginning to work on. We're developing the series now. We are, in fact, looking for support. This is a wonderful project for the upcoming 250th anniversary of the United States, and a great opportunity to get out in front of those big celebrations happening in a few years' time with this particular story, because it's one that's so familiar, but yet has this great German American heritage behind it and can really, I think, bring a lot of awareness to the rich German heritage that exists in this country. So I'm going to play that first, and then we'll jump into the presentation, which runs about an hour. And I do hope you enjoy all of it. So if you'll bear with me very briefly, I will share my screen, and we'll take a look at the teaser first.
There are so many great icons of Western art. Some are so famous they seem to have always been there. But what stories do they actually tell?
The 54th were as much the great emancipators as Abraham Lincoln.
My name is Paul Glenshaw, and in Art Plus History, I'll take you back in time to the moments these works were seen in public for the very first time. Just like I've done for the Smithsonian Associates for the past 2 years. We'll discover the relationship of the artworks, their creators, and their stories to their time and place, and to the people who saw them for the first time. Why was this icon of the American Revolution painted in Germany? The day before Jean-Paul Marat was assassinated, the artist visited him in the very room he was killed. They marched down Beacon Street off to war. What did they have to prove? This moment of modern Parisian calm came only a few years after the city's near destruction. In Art Plus History, we'll learn the often surprising and always fascinating backstories to these landmark creations that have been woven into our culture, yet for many viewers today have meanings that can feel distant. Art Plus History will erase that distance. Because art comes from people living their lives in the real world, just like you and me. I'm Paul Glenshaw, your host for Art Plus History, a Maryland Public Television presentation.
Okay, there we have it. So let's jump into Washington Crossing the Delaware. a couple of things about what the presentation is and what the presentation is not. So the presentation will give those of you who are not familiar with the backstory, certainly that backstory, the historical story of Washington crossing the Delaware River itself, as well as the story of Emanuel Leutze, how he came to be the one to paint this. So it will not be an exhaustive biography of Emanuel Leutze. We will get him up to painting Washington crossing the Delaware. It's not a comprehensive history of the battles of 1776 at all. There are plenty of wonderful resources for that. What this does is try to pull everything together and give you that context so that when you see this painting, you have a richer understanding of it. And your curiosity may well be piqued to visit it, to visit the places where it was created, where the crossing actually happened, and so on. So we begin, since this will be seen by people from many different places, we've got to orient ourselves. And I had the great pleasure last week of presenting this in person at the German American Historical Foundation Museum in Washington, D.C. So that's where we'll begin. So let's dive down into Washington, D.C. As you'll see, a lot of what I do in my presentations, it's about a sense of place, to orient ourselves in both time and place. So here we are now. Let's begin here in Washington, and we're going to get ourselves quickly to the moment that the painting was seen in public for the very first time. And it certainly wasn't in Washington, D.C., which did not exist when George Washington crossed the Delaware. Although it did exist when Leutze painted the picture, but it was not there. So we leave Washington, D.C., and we're going to take a brief stop to just familiarize ourselves with the other main character mentioned in the title of the painting, the Delaware. So here it is, the Delaware River. It divides Delaware itself, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. It is quite a long river, 301 miles long. It's sourced in upstate New York. Though its width at the confluence of the sources is only 275 feet, but where it empties into the Chesapeake Bay, it's almost 4 miles across. So it gets very wide. And for those of you like me who've been mostly familiar with the Delaware River as we see it as we cross the Delaware Memorial Bridge, yes, it's a very wide river, but it's a very different river further upstream where George Washington actually crossed. We'll be going there. But this also sort of begs the question, you know, if you hadn't been aware of the backstory of the painting and you wondered, well, where was it created? You'd probably have some pretty logical guesses. If we moved up the map a little bit, you know, Philadelphia was one of the biggest cities in the country at the time it was painted. Reasonable to assume it was painted there or somewhere near where it happened, like Trenton. But you'd be wrong. It would be safe to assume that the painting was created in New York. In the mid-19th century, there were a lot of it was a growing art world in New York City. And indeed, the painting that we all know today is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It'd be safe to assume that it was painted in New York. But it was not. It wasn't painted in New York. It wasn't painted in New Jersey. It wasn't painted anywhere in the United States. It was painted across the Atlantic Ocean in Europe. And more specifically, it was painted in Germany. And if we're going to go to the place where it was seen for the first time, well, we're close to the place now, or we're closer. Let's get to the right time. So this is a map of Germany at the time, about 1850. Actually, exactly, December 22nd, 1850 was the first time this painting was seen in public. And as we can see, in the mid-19th century, the map of what we now know as a unified Germany was a much different place. But to get to where the painting was actually seen, we go to Cologne. And it was here on December the 22nd, 1850, that the painting was seen for the very first time. And I'm going to pause here for a moment and apologize in advance for my German pronunciations or my bad attempts at them. And I'll do my best. But here at the Kaufhaus Gesernach was where the painting was seen for the first time. And this building still exists there. And the painting that was seen was this painting. Now, the painting was not a black and white painting. It was a color painting. But this is the only image that we have of the painting that was first seen, because the painting that's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art is not this painting. This is the first version of Washington crossing the Delaware. The one that we know, that the world knows at the Metropolitan, is the second version. This painting, this black and white photograph of a color painting, is the only image that exists of the original first version of Washington crossing the Delaware. Why are there two versions? We'll get to that. But this version of the painting no longer exists. It was damaged in a fire soon after it was shown for the first time in the artist's studio, in Leutze's studio. And it's a long story, but through an insurance company, it wound up in the art museum in Bremen. And that museum was very badly damaged in an Allied bombing in 1942 during the Second World War. And the original version of Washington crossing the Delaware was destroyed. So that's one of the first mysteries to clear up, is that the painting that we all know was not the painting that was first seen. It's the second painting. The first one was painted in Germany for German audience. The second one was painted to be sent to New York, which it was. But both versions of the painting were done north of Cologne in Düsseldorf, which is where Emanuel Leutze, artist, lived. And so this, of course, is the famous Washington crossing the Delaware that we all know, the painting in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It is absolutely an icon of American history, of the American Revolution, but it has its origins in what was happening, in what happened with Washington crossing the Delaware, obviously, but also at the time and place where Leutze painted it, and the events that were going on around him in Germany that inspired him to create this painting. A lot of things came together, so we'll be getting into that. But just a quick look at the painting first. We'll be taking a very detailed look at it at the end of the presentation. And we'll also see the differences between the first and second versions. You know, this painting is such an icon. We all recognize it. George Washington standing up as he, and as you can see in the background, a very large group of soldiers, horses, weapons, are making their way across the ice-choked Delaware River. This is a moment of real desperation for all of them. The very survival and ability to continue the fight for independence from Great Britain depends on the outcome of this crossing and what their objective is in making the crossing of the Delaware. It's a very critical moment. And Leutze pulls together so many different elements to bring us the story, to bring it to life in a way that we can engage with it very directly and immediately. I'll be talking more about this later, but it is very important to note at the very beginning that paintings like this, what's generally known as history paintings, are not documents of the actual event. They represent the event. They are an artistic interpretation, much in the same way that Julius Caesar by William Shakespeare is not a documentary of the death of Julius Caesar. It's historical fiction. It's based on a true story. So we'll be looking at that much later. And as I said, we'll be taking a very detailed look at the painting. By the time we get back to this painting, you'll know all about how it came to be and what the story is being told. And it's a very curious thing. Why would this man, Emanuel Leutze, a German American, be inspired to create a painting in 1850 of an event that had happened 75 years before? What was going on around him that made him want to explore the subject? Well, in order to get to that, we need to understand why Washington crossed the Delaware in the first place. So we are going to leave Düsseldorf and we are going to go back across the Atlantic. We'll jump across the ocean a couple of times, And we are actually going to return to New York. This is where our story actually begins. But we're in New York in 1776. So to give a little background, George Washington was here in New York in 1776, preparing to meet the British in battle. This was going to be the next major scene of action in the American Revolution, which was well underway. In April 1775, the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. In June of that year, there was the famous Battle of Bunker Hill in Boston, where most of the action in the war was taking place up in New England in the Massachusetts-Boston area. This is where the rush to arms had fully happened, and the armies were now fully engaged in this conflict. The British lay siege to Boston. Washington took command in July 1775 in Cambridge, excuse me, let me go back, and ended the siege of Boston with a bombardment of the city, and the British left, and the British moved south. And that's why Washington came south to New York to fortify it and be ready for the British and be able to stand against them. Things didn't quite go to plan. Washington spent months fortifying New York City, but as we'll see, it was basically all for nothing. On July the 29th, the Army and the Navy of Great Britain were led by two brothers, General William Howe and Admiral Richard Howe, excuse me, of the Army and Navy respectively. And they brought an overwhelming, well-trained, well-fed force to New York. And Washington was totally outmatched and outclassed. On June the 29th, New York Bay filled with first scores, then hundreds of ships. Howe's army was arriving from Halifax, and he was soon joined by his brother, and they were encamped on Staten Island. This is at a very heady time. This is July 1776. We all, of course, know what happened on July the 4th, 1776, but on July the 9th, a reading of the Declaration of Independence was made to Washington's troops. As Washington is trying to prepare for this battle, he has very little decent intelligence about the size of the force that he's against, where they are, just intelligence about the enemy in general, and really did not understand what their plans might be. The British Army is the best and biggest in the world at this point. As I said, very well trained, very well equipped, very well armed. They are augmented by Hessian mercenaries who have been hired by the British, by the king, to augment the British troops. They too are extremely well trained, armed, fed, clothed. They're a formidable force. Washington is dealing with whatever he's got. He's got a lot of citizen soldiers, very few professional soldiers, and they are armed with whatever they have. There's not a lot of money to pay or equip them. At this stage, many of those who had signed up to be in the Continental Army were looking forward in a few months to their conscriptions being finished and being able to leave and go back home. So this is a very quick sketch of the forces on opposite sides. The battle is joined with the Battle of Long Island on August the 26th, 1776. And very quickly thereafter, in a rapid succession of engagements, Washington is defeated and pushed back at almost every turn, and pushed up the island of Manhattan, where they are finally the last American holdout. The British offensive begins in late August. By November, the last American holdout in New York is Fort Washington, and Washington barely escapes with his troops across the Hudson River. This is a very desperate time for them. Fort Lee across the river is captured which was the main American encampment in New Jersey, was captured on November the 19th. So about 3,000 Americans were captured, a lot of munitions. It was a rout, a very bad situation. And the British pressed the chase and essentially chased Washington across the state of New Jersey. Washington managing to keep his very bedraggled army very poorly fed. Many of them, their boots long gone, and many of them eager to leave the army. They skirmished in Newark, but Washington did manage to stay ahead of the British as the fall wore on and winter started to close in. The change of seasons bought him some time, and he crossed the Delaware for the first time down in Trenton to get into Pennsylvania. And so that's where our story brings us, is why Washington getting into Pennsylvania. We see where the British and the Americans decided to hunker down into the winter. So things were kind of at a stalemate. The British in Trenton and Washington just north at a place called McConkey's Ferry. So we're going to leave the story of Washington there, because that's now we've got Washington on one side of the Delaware and the British on the other. So if he's going to engage the British, he has to cross the Delaware. So we'll get to that. We're moving a little bit further south to the city of Philadelphia, and we're going to move forward in time now, just a little bit. So let's move to a contemporary map of after the into the 19th century. This is in the early 19th century, a map of Philadelphia, one of the largest cities at the time in the United States, what was then the United States. And we'll begin the story of Emanuel Leutze here in Philadelphia. He was born on May the 24th, 1816, in a place called Schwäbisch Gmünd in Germany. He immigrated into the United States when he was 9 years old in 1825, and they came to Philadelphia. His father died when Leutze was quite young, and Leutze, as a child, had been showing rather precocious ability in drawing and in painting, and that was a way for him to actually earn some money by creating pictures, painting portraits of places. Here we see a picture of him in 1846, much later, after he had gone to Germany. This is a self-portrait that's in the collection of Georgetown University. So his first instructor in Philadelphia was this man, John Reuben Smith, who was a British artist who'd emigrated to the United States and made his living doing portraits and teaching and doing, as you can see one of his pictures on the left, street scenes and pictures of people's businesses that he would sell. And he did quite well for himself and was a good, very solid, if not terribly inspired artist. He was a good, solid instructor for this precocious young student, Emanuel Leutze. And Leutze very quickly developed serious skills. Here, what he specialized in at the beginning of his career are these miniature watercolor portraits, because these were images that could be done quickly, they could be done cheaply, and they could be sold. People would like to have these things to put in pendants and lockets, and have as keepsakes and mementos and things like that. So he actually developed a pretty good business with this. He was something of an itinerant artist. He worked a lot around the Philadelphia area into rural Pennsylvania, came down to the Washington, D.C. area, worked in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and generally developed and honed his skills as he worked. He developed something of a following. He developed patrons who saw in him such promising ability that many of them actually donated money to him to help him go abroad to study art, to really get proper formal training in art. And that's what he did. In early 1841, in late 1840, Emanuel Leutze made the very logical decision. If you were going to go study art somewhere, the art instruction world was still very primitive in the United States. The very beginnings of art academies were underway. But if you really wanted to go get trained, you went in the traditions of Western art, you went to Europe. And the great places to go were either Paris or Dusseldorf. And a lot of Americans favored Dusseldorf, and it made perfect sense for Emanuel Leutze. This is his homeland. So we are going back to Dusseldorf, again, back to the Germany, as we'd call it today, but as it was seen at the time. And so we're now back in Dusseldorf. This was a great place for Leutze to go. And as I said, a lot of Americans favored going to Dusseldorf. There was a renowned, it still is, a renowned art academy there, which had a great tradition and its own tradition, really, of narrative painting. Of course, they taught all sorts of, they ran the gamut of what could be done in art there, but there was a tradition coming out of Dusseldorf of creating historical paintings or history paintings, paintings that told stories, whether imagined, as this one is, or telling stories from recent history or ancient history, and setting them in grand landscape settings and making, I always think of them, these almost look like, the opening shots to great movies or something. And I'll talk a lot about that. I like to see paintings like this as one frame movies. It helps us kind of understand the approach to storytelling in a way that feels relevant to us in the 21st century. So Leutze made his choice to go there. There was a lot for him to learn and a lot of very great instructors like Carl Friedrich Lessing, whose work we see here, Adolf Tidemand, who specialized, and this was one of the other things that happened with in the Düsseldorf Academy, was an emphasis on looking at not just figures from classical or biblical history, but looking at people from contemporary life. Realism was something that was definitely growing at this time. Certainly Gustave Courbet in France, but the German Dusseldorf painters, this was an emphasis for them. And as you'll see, Leutze starts to pull all of this together. It has a huge influence on him. But some of the other Americans who were there, who took these approaches and turned it into their own signature American style when they returned to the United States, were artists like Eastman Johnson, taking that idea of looking at their own surroundings and their own people, but being able to tell these grand narrative stories where we don't need a lot of, we can read this painting very clearly, children playing in a stagecoach. It's a very charming scene. We don't need a lot of, the artist has given us really everything we need to interpret what's happening in this picture. Similarly, with the sweep of landscape that was available to the artists in Germany, they brought back and looked at their own landscape, even if it's just a quiet cove in Newport, Rhode Island. Worthington Whitridge was one of Leutze's great friends there in Dusseldorf. And Dusseldorf, here we see another American, Henry Ritter, who did this portrait of Dusseldorf, of Leutze, excuse me, in painting in his studio. He was quite a popular guy there. He was very active in certainly his studies, of course, but also in the social life of the artists there. He was a popular guy. He was, a very good company. And it was, in fact, another young German American who came over to Dusseldorf to study, who had the bad misfortune of the artist who he wanted to study with in Dusseldorf dying while this young American was coming over. His name was Albert Bierstadt, later the great famous painter of the American West. Bierstadt arrived in Dusseldorf and his teacher was dead, and Leutze and Whitridge and some of the other Americans kind of took him under their wing. So he was something of a mentor figure as well to younger Americans who came. But he was a very ambitious guy and wanting to set out on his own path. And so he really had this unique situation being a German American, having, lived the first part of his childhood in Germany, then the rest of his formative years in the United States, in Philly, but then coming back to Germany to be in his formative years as an artist. He's really in both worlds. So he's taking what he's learned in Dusseldorf, this grand tradition of narrative history painting, and starting to adapt it to American subjects. And his first sort of major sequence of paintings is a series of paintings about the story of Christopher Columbus, and creating a known, instantly recognizable character in Christopher Columbus, and finding very specific moments in the story of Christopher Columbus that help tell the story of the origin of America, at least as it was seen at that time. And again, think of this as a one-frame movie. So this is Columbus before the Queen Isabella. Is he going to be, trying to get the okay to make his voyage across the Atlantic Ocean? And you can really see how Leutze has taken this aesthetic of this grand history storytelling in pictures. And he's of the same mindset to me as somebody like Cecil B. DeMille. These grand history movies that we saw coming out all throughout the 20th century that are still done. It's that same sensibility. If you think of this as a one-frame movie, you're looking at a set. A set is created. It's just a picture of a set, but he's made a set. He's placed his characters in it in specific places, wearing specific costumes, lit in a specific way, acting in a specific manner to help tell the story, to get so many different feelings across. Columbus, both resolute and pleading, the Queen clearly not looking very impressed, and all the different other expressions that you see, and just the richness of the image in the color and the costume and everything. This is that sort of narrative painting on a grand scale. So you can just see, if you imagine back to those little portrait miniatures he was painting when he was a young man in Philly, to what he's evolved into, we can start to see the trajectory that Leutze is on. And we're now going to get to why he intersected with the story of George Washington. And it all had to do with what was going on in the political landscape, not just in Germany, but across Europe. So this is a painting by one of the Düsseldorf Academy painters, one of the instructors there, Johann Peter Hasenclever, workers at the magistrates. And if we look at this painting, they're so good at giving us what we need to understand the dynamics of the story. We've got group in the foreground, then out the window, another group in the background. The group in the foreground is divided in half. We've got a group on the left, group on the right. Group on the left are tough-looking guys, workers. They've got rough-hewn clothes, and they're petitioning these very rich-looking magistrates. And outside, we see a speaker with his hands up, exhorting the crowd. This is the beginnings of unrest. The 1840s across Europe was a time of great upheaval. There was pressure building. There was so much that was changing at this time. A lot of city dwellers were dealing with a lot of economic dislocation. Many people had moved in from farms where there weren't as many people required to work the farms because of the advances in farm machinery. Artisans, people making one-off widgets of whatever kind, were starting to be replaced by mass production. And governments were generally, the monarchies and other governments across Europe were very slow to adapt to these changes, and a change from an agrarian-based economy to an industrial-based economy. This industrial revolution was causing a lot of upheaval. And then there was just the misfortunes of the time, the Hungry 40s, as they were known, the Hungry 1840s. This is the start of the potato blight in Ireland. But there were bad harvests across Europe, so food prices would skyrocket. And it is in this world that some new ideas really started to become important. This is a quote, a review of this painting that was printed in the New York Times about this particular painting. And what the art critic wrote was, what the writer could only analyze, the eminent painter has reproduced in its dramatic vitality. In other words, the pressure between, and this coming clash between these dispossessed working class people, government's not responding fast enough, and other pressures coming to bear. And the writer of this particular quote was none other than Karl Marx, whose Communist Manifesto is created at this time. So this upheaval is not is very widespread. The sorry, let's just take a look at Europe at the time. Of course, the political map very different from how it is today. But this pressure was building across Europe. As I said, these bad harvests and a lot of discontent among the many, many working class people. So it was not, and it also there were new ideas. There was a lot of abolitionist fervor that was growing across Europe. Ideas about freedom. Britain had freed slaves in 1833, 1838, but not in Europe. In 1843, Moldova freed the slaved Roma. In 1848, France re-emancipated its slaves. They had emancipated them during the Revolution, and Napoleon re-enslaved them. And in 1845, the noted American abolitionist Frederick Douglass made his first trip to the UK and Ireland, and he was already a celebrity, and his fame was growing. So there's a lot of push against the established order. And this comes to a head in 1848, when riots start to erupt across Europe. It begins in Sicily, spreads to Paris, to Berlin, several places in Germany, Denmark, Vienna, Budapest, Sweden, Poland, Romania, Belgium, Ireland. These are the 1848ers, the 1848 revolutions across Germany, across Europe, are the result of all this pressure. This is when everything blows. And in Germany, if we focus on there, Germany is this loose affiliation of these many states, this loose confederation, and it's in 1848, in May, that there is an assembly that's convened in Frankfurt, and this is the first sort of attempt at a unified Republican government in Germany. It's doomed from the start. There's so much infighting amongst all the different factions of people wanting this autonomy. But it does result in a draft of a Declaration of Rights of the German people. It establishes a Reich, and they actually offered the crown to Friedrich Wilhelm IV, but he refused a crown from the gutter. He marched his forces against the assembly, which was forcefully dispersed on June the 18th and then officially dissolved on May the 31st, 1849. So it was very short-lived, but it was there's groundswell of effort to move into a new time and a new place in that reflected, the changes, the dramatic changes that were happening at the time. But these revolutions across Europe were generally all failed and were swept up very quickly. And it's in this environment that Emanuel Leutze was in Germany, was in Düsseldorf. He was leading a faction of artists to be independent of the academy. He is looking for American subjects that will help him professionally as an artist. He wants to have commissions. He's looking around him and seeing this effort to establish democracy in Germany, his other country, his homeland. And then he looks back to his other country, the United States, and finds in the story of Washington crossing the Delaware the perfect subject, because the revolutions all around him are in trouble. Washington, when he crossed the Delaware, was in trouble. It was all about being steadfast, about looking forward, about pushing forward despite the odds. And this is what galvanizes Leutze to create this image. So let's find out why the crossing itself was such a gamble for George Washington. So let's bounce back to the United States and get ourselves back where we left off on the Delaware River. So here is the scene of the action. Let's go to that same place in 1776. George Washington is up at a place called McConkey's Ferry. Colonel Rall is in Trenton and Donop down in Burdenton. Rall and Donop are the Hessian commanders. So that's where they are on opposite sides of the Delaware River. Washington conceives a plan to do something. He needs a win. He's convinced a lot of the soldiers who were going to rotate out because their commissions were up to stay. He actually got Congress and their private donors who got money to him to pay them. He was able to keep them fed enough. He was able to hold his fairly tiny force together. Trenton, he knows, is not fortified, and that's where the Hessians had arrived to encamp on December the 14th. And so Washington conceives this plan to make a surprise attack on Trenton and capture Trenton to get really one in the win column for the Continental Army. But it is a very fraught and very risky move. Let's look at where he actually crossed here at McConkey's Ferry. This is the site of the location. You can go there today. There's a wonderful place called the Washington Crossing Historical Park. This is the location. And every year they do a recreation of the crossing. So we'll take a look at that now, just to give you a sense of the costumes and the kind of boats that they used and so on. Let me just jump to that. Oh, sorry. Let me get to that in a second. Why this was so risky. I'll show you the reenactment video in just a second. Why this was so risky. So Washington really had nothing left. He had really just one move to make. If he had enough resources and enough will on the part of his troops to make this gamble with him. But he knows that if he fails, this is the end. There's nothing left. He's betting everything on this attack, on securing a victory and maintaining the momentum of the revolution, or reinvigorating it, restarting it after the disaster in New York, to keep the revolution alive. It is on the very verge of failure. So this is a huge decision that he has to make. If he fails and they capture him, he's a dead man. Fortunately for Washington, the noted pamphleteer Thomas Paine pens one of his most famous pamphlets at this time, called The American Crisis. He was the author of Common Sense. And the very famous opening lines are, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of his country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman." And this, too, helped rally the morale of Washington and the troops to be able to push through and make this attempt. Absolutely no guarantees. And everything that could go wrong did go wrong. There were actually 3 crossings. Washington up at the ferry, And then he had General Cadwalader and General Ewing crossing at Trenton and Bordenton, respectively. The decision is made to go on Christmas night. And of the three crossings, only one succeeds, Washington's. Ewing and Cadwalader are unable to get across. And when Washington crosses, he has no idea that they failed. Not only that, but as the crossing begins, the weather turns terrible. And this is horrible for Washington because the whole key to this attack succeeding is surprise. They want to be over the river by midnight. They want to be at Trenton before dawn, before 6 a.m. But it doesn't happen that way because in the middle of all of this, a nor'easter comes blowing in. It is pitch black, but also whiteout conditions, if you can imagine that. A huge blizzard, and these are and the river is choked with ice. So these are the conditions that he's facing as he makes the call to send about 2,400 troops and horses and weapons across the river in whatever boats they had at hand. So to talk about the boats, they used a whole variety of boats. One of his smart moves when they first got down to Pennsylvania was to get as many boats as he could across to the Pennsylvania side. So the British didn't have any boats themselves. And a lot of the boats that they used were called Durham boats. And here we see reproductions of them at Washington Crossing Park. And they're very big boats. They were used mostly to ship pig iron along the river. So they were very deep. So they did, in fact, stand up in the boats, but you would only see them from about their chests up. So here's that video that shows them going across. This is from Washington Crossing State Park. This is their 2020 reenactment. And they're going in the daylight, without any ice, without any snow. And I watched them do it last year when the current was quite strong, and they really struggled to get across. Yeah. So it was a very, very difficult crossing.
Pull.
So the crossing reenactment is a tradition that goes back many decades, and I highly recommend going. It was really fun, actually. And there was a huge crowd there. It was really neat to see. But there was a huge crowd there in 1776, and it was cold, starving, tired, nervous soldiers with their commander, George Washington. So getting across was just the first hurdle. Then they had to actually get to Trenton. And by the time they got across with all the troubles, the weather included, they were 3 hours behind schedule. And again, he doesn't know that the other two surprise attack crossings have failed. He doesn't know that his attack, that his troops, his group is on its own. So from the Jersey side of the river, they have two routes to take. They divide the troops. Washington goes with General Nathaniel Greene, and General Sullivan goes on the southern route. Greene takes the northern route. It's very difficult. They are, again, in the snow, in the middle of the night, up and down, muddy paths, slippery paths, icy, branches, brambles, all sorts of, they have to cross streams. It's a very difficult passage to get down to Trenton, still not knowing, do they still have the element of surprise or not? Well, they get down there, and by the time they arrive, which was supposed to be pre-dawn, the sun has come up. It's a stormy day, but they actually still have the element of surprise. They are very, very lucky. Now, when I was a kid in elementary school, I remember being taught that Washington was able to surprise the Hessian soldiers because it was Christmas night that they went over, and the Hessian soldiers had been up partying all night, and they had all had too much to drink, and they were all passed out. And so Washington could just swoon in there. Not the case. Not the case. That's not what happened. In fact, the Hessians knew that Washington was going to attack. He was going to come across at some point. It made sense. They were unclear exactly what he was going to do, or when he was going to do it. But it made no sense to cross the river in the middle of that storm. So their guard was actually down. Their awareness was up, but at that particular moment, it hadn't made much sense that Washington would actually do it, but he did. And when they attacked, it was over very quickly. The Hessians, there were only a few out on sentry duty, if you will. They tried to regroup. They tried to get themselves out to meet the American force. But Washington and his men had the upper hand. They did still manage miraculously to have that element of surprise. And so the battle was over actually very quickly. The battle was engaged about 8 o'clock in the morning. Rall was killed. And the Hessians were captured, although some managed to escape and get to Lord Cornwallis, the British general who was in command of the troops in New Jersey, and tell him what had happened. So Cornwallis begins to march towards Trenton, which leads to the very next battle, which happens right after New Year's Day, in the Second Battle of Trenton, where Washington is lucky enough to have the high ground, but Cornwallis has a huge force. And Washington's very clever. As the night falls after this battle, he builds big bonfires and makes sure that the British can see men moving around the bonfires. Meanwhile, behind that literal smokescreen, he's getting everybody out and moving north towards Princeton. So when the British come across in the morning, there's nobody there. And so then the battle moves on to the Battle of Princeton on January the 3rd, and Washington is victorious. So his huge gamble has paid off. And the Continental Army lives to fight another day. Basically, both sides then retreat for the rest of the winter. So Washington has kept the revolution alive. He gambled everything, and it worked. And it's the inspiration of that story that Leutze took for his own surroundings and his own fellow countrymen in Germany, that their revolution was faltering, it was failing, but you had to keep going. You had to keep pushing forward. So it was really for both his German audience and his American audience. So now we get to the painting itself and the stories, how Leutze, with all of his training and his experience, bringing to bear on how to show Washington crossing the Delaware as something for both all of his fellow countrymen, his American countrymen and his German countrymen. So now we come to the painting that we all know so well. And what I'll be doing is isolating different parts of the painting so we can focus on them, and then we'll look at details. But before we do that, just want to reinforce this point. This painting has something in common with all of these movies. And what that is that all these movies are based on a true story. They are visual narrative depictions of historical stories. The filmmakers, the directors, the producers, the set designers, the costume designers, the composers, all of them work together to create a fiction, a story that relates the historical story, but is not, I mean, of all of these, probably the closest is Apollo 13 to what actually happened. Maybe All the President's Men, all of them are rooted in truth, and they have varying degrees of accuracy, but in all of them, choices are made to present a compelling narrative. And the same thing happens in Washington crossing the Delaware. And the first thing that Leutze, I imagine, did is not paint the painting at the time of day that the crossing actually happened, in the middle of the night. He sets it during the daytime. Why? Very simple. so we can see it, so we can make out who the characters are, so we can see and recognize the different faces. It's a matter of lighting it so that we can actually see it. So that's the first big choice that he makes. Also showing how Washington is crossing the Delaware. Now, one of the things I've always heard as a criticism of this painting is that Washington's going the wrong direction because he went from the west to the east. And, well, if you're looking at a normal map, yes, west is to the left. But if you're looking from upstream to downstream, then he's crossing from the right to the left. So it's all just a matter of where you're standing. So he is crossing the river, the right direction. So let's look at some details. Leutze does, I think, a pretty brilliant job in getting across the idea that this was a very large group for a crossing, but it's a very small army. So that's quite an interesting thing to try and figure out how to show. There's a lot of men and horses crossing the river, but it's not endless. It's finite. And that's what he does quite brilliantly in the group in the background. And you can see, there's a very active group in the foreground, but if we just isolate the background characters, you can see how much activity is going on back there. So whatever's going on in the front boat, there's that much movement and action and chaos, almost controlled chaos, in all of the other boats. So he gives us just enough to see a couple of horses and guys with poles and people in all sorts of active poses to suggest that this is all the activity that's required to get them across the river. Let's look at the boat itself. Now, one of the other things that people jump all over this painting about is that the sides of the boat are too small. Washington never could have stood up on that boat. He would have fallen over. Well, as I explained before, the boats that he actually went over in, it comes up to their chests. So if he had the size, the boat at the proper depth, there wouldn't be much to see. So he changes the shape of the boat so we can see the characters in the boat. And he makes Washington stand because he's the most important. So again, it's all about the staging and the blocking of the scene. So the boat has been altered so that we can see inside the boat. Very simple thing. The ice. The ice is interesting because I think it's not only a historical detail that's important. I think there's symbolic as well. And this is my interpretation, that there's so many obstacles in front of Washington that he has to overcome in order to have this victory work. And the very first one is the ice itself. There's the water itself has frozen and has become obstacles, and they've got to get past that. And so that's where we see all the activity in the boat itself, trying to get this boat through the water. And it's really a handful of figures that we're seeing here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Only 8 that I've highlighted here. But Leutze does a very clever trick here as well. They're all wearing, there's no uniform. None of them have a uniform. They're all wearing something different. And some show Scottish heritage, some show the influence of Native Americans, some have come from Europe recently, some have been out into the western part of the United States. They're coming from all over. This is what Washington has pulled together, e pluribus unum, from many one. Just to give you a little hint of some of Leutze's process. Very detailed studies of a lot of the characters survive, not all of them survive. But here you can see this character, one of the guys holding the flag, and you can see how Leutze began what this man should look like, but then how he changed him. The face is in a slightly different position. So there's a lot of little decisions that go into what actors he's got in the show and how they're positioned. Figuring out how to show the oarsmen getting the ice out of the way. How do you show that properly? So here you see in the drawing, what's I think, a pretty clumsy attempt. It doesn't look like you're going to be very effective pushing anything that way, or, rowing a boat. But the characters that he actually came up with are very forcibly pushing the ice out of the way. Then we see this character, who is unusual because he's the only Black person in the whole picture. At first, he was thought to be a guy named Prince Whipple, but more than likely, he represents a Marbleheader. This is the 14th Massachusetts Continentals, who came from Marblehead, Massachusetts, and it was an integrated unit. And these were guys known for their prowess in maritime stuff and sailing and wrangling boats. So that's why we see him. And then we come to the group in the center of the boat, or the main, the actual figures who are based on named characters. The first is Nathaniel Greene, very important general to Washington, his right-hand man, who was not in the same boat as Washington, but they did cross together. So Leutze puts Greene in the boat. And then behind Washington is this young, very determined-looking soldier holding the flag. And this is actually James Monroe. This represents James Monroe, who was only 19 at the time and was part of the group that made the crossing. He did not cross with Washington, but of course he later becomes president himself. So he's got the guy who will be the first president, and then one of his successors. So naturally he puts them together in the boat. Then there's the flag, and this is one of the things that people jump over the painting about, is that this is that wasn't the flag. That flag didn't exist at the time. Yes, but Leutze is saying this is what's going to come out of this crossing. Ultimately, it will lead to that flag and what that flag represents. Again, remember who he's showing this picture to first, his German compatriots. He wants them to look forward. He wants them to be resolute. And that's what he shows them, obviously, in the figure of Washington. Washington knows all that he's up against. He knows the consequences of what happens if this thing goes sideways. And yet there he stands, absolutely firm, eyes forward, resolute, staring at the distant shore that is almost out of the frame, that he's going to get across. And it's that kind of faith in one's own mission that's so important. Now, the face of George Washington was based on a very famous portrait sculpture that was done of George Washington from life. The famous French portrait sculptor named Jean-Antoine Houdon actually came to Mount Vernon. This was years later, after the war, after Washington was president, and he made a life mask. He actually cast plaster on Washington's face and sculpted Washington. He was there for about 2 weeks. And Houdon was known for the accuracy of his likenesses. So from that, many images of Washington were based, because then that was turned into prints, and those were widely distributed. And the original plaster bust is at the National Portrait Gallery, and I made a drawing of it recently. But that's what the face of Washington is based on. So here we see Leutze's portrait study of Washington, trying to get his likeness down before he commits it to the full canvas. So then that brings us to the whole painting. Now we see who's who. We know where they were crossing. We know why they were crossing. We know why Leutze painted this painting. We know why it was done in Germany. And we can now compare it to the very first version that I showed you right at the top of the talk. So here is the first version. Here's the second version. They're almost identical, and they don't line up absolutely perfectly, but you can see some changes. Like if you look at the sailors in the front pushing the ice, he's changed their positions slightly. In the background images where we see 2 horses, in this, there's only 1. He's changed the position of the flag a little bit. So there's minor changes. If you can see I'll show you with my cursor. This sailor right here, who we showed the drawing of, he changes position. So in other words, this is version 2. So the first one was damaged. It went to Bremen. It was destroyed in 1942. The second version was painted immediately after the first version and was sent to New York. That's why it was created. and it caused quite a sensation in New York. It arrived in 1853. I'm sorry, in 1850. Yeah, in 1853. Leutze sailed with the painting to New York City, and it was on display from late October until late February 1852. And more than 50,000 people came to see it. And Leutze, is also a businessman. And as you can see in the clipping up at the top, admission to see the painting was 25 cents. This was like going to the movies. You went to go see this great national picture and have the experience of this spectacle. And I love the fact that you could buy season tickets for 50 cents. So it was a huge sensation in the United States at the beginning, and was a wonderful way for Leutze, who then stayed the rest of his life in the United States, to launch his career. There's been a lot of different interpretations of the painting. This is by Roger Shinomura, a Japanese-American painter, who did this version of Shinomura crossing the Delaware, pulling on his Japanese heritage. This is by a Canadian named Kent Monkman, who's adapting the themes of the painting to indigenous people, making a more contemporary commentary based on Leutze's composition. And so these are pretty heady stuff. But it goes from the sublime to the ridiculous, of course, with this ad for Lloyd J. Harris cherry pie filling. This was the advertisement and what was used on the label for the cans, where the ice has been turned into cherry pie slices. Keep it classy, America. Leutze came to the nation's capital, came to Washington, D.C., and it's there that he died in 1868. He was doing mural commissions for the Capitol building, and unfortunately succumbed to the heat one very hot July in 1868. And he's buried in the Glenwood Cemetery there. And the painting that we all know was acquired by the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1897. It was sold for $10,000 to a guy named Marshall O. Roberts, and it is on really stunning display at the Met with this incredible frame, which has its own story, how the frame was rediscovered and recreated. So that is the course of my presentation. I want to thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And thank you so much to the German American Historical Foundation. And please do consider supporting our effort together to bring this story to television. This is a great way to underscore German contributions to American culture with this icon. And so we'd be delighted to, if any of you are interested in supporting, please do be in touch. And thank you so much for your kind attention. We appreciate it.
Thank you so very much, Paul. What a wonderful presentation, and what a fascinating story behind this painting. It's amazing how Emanuel Leutze, a German immigrant to the United States, took inspiration from the birth of the country, this epic battle, which is really a David versus Goliath battle. And Washington was facing almost insurmountable odds there with his poorly equipped troops, and fighting against these very well equipped British troops, supplemented by Hessian mercenaries. And I'd like to point out that there were also some German Americans living in what was then still the colonies, and they overwhelmingly supported Washington and the revolution. There were some that remained loyal to the king, to the crown, but for the most part, they actually supported the revolution. And interestingly enough, the first translation of the Declaration of Independence into another language was into German. And that was done by a newspaper man, a printer with a knack for public relations and promotion in Philadelphia. He put an announcement in his paper on the 5th of July, 1776. He hadn't managed to secure a copy of the document just yet, and definitely hadn't finished the translation. But by the 9th of July, only 5 days later, he had a completed German translation that he published on the front page of his paper. And you can imagine that that was quite the hit. And this was in the days pre-social media, no internet, definitely no Twitter, not even telephones or even Morse code and telegraph.
Of course.
Wires.
There's certainly no cut and paste.
No, absolutely not. This was all done by hand. But, you know, even back then, communication certainly worked. And I love how Leutze picked up on that. And thank you for pointing out that the original, well, it is an original. The second version of this painting can be visited in New York at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. There is a third version that is once again held by a private collector. It was displayed in the White House for a number of years, but last year it was actually sold by Christie's for $45 million, I believe. And so it is really a priceless piece of art, a priceless piece of Americana. And the mural that you mentioned, Westward Ho, is in the Capitol. And if people come to DC and manage to get a visit, one of those coveted tickets to visit the Capitol building, that can also be seen. And Paul, you have some other documentaries out. Could you just briefly mention what they are and where they can be viewed? And also, can you just give us an approximate timeline of when we can expect this wonderful series, Art Plus History?
Certainly. To answer your first question, my other documentaries that can currently be seen are the main one is called the Lafayette Escadrille, and that is a story about the First World War and the Americans who volunteered for the French as fighter pilots during the First World War, and that is available now. It's sporadically broadcast. In fact, it was broadcast just recently around Memorial Day because it's an American military story, but it can be found on the PBS Passport streaming application. So if you're a member of your PBS station, you have Passport, and you can watch it there. There's also the 20-minute version of the film on YouTube that you can find for free. And then the timeline for Art Plus History is really dependent on our being able to raise the funding for the project. We estimate that the production time would be about 18 months. And we're hoping for a 2024, 2025 release of the series. The first, as you saw in the teaser, the first season will be 4 episodes, and one of the episodes will be Washington crossing the Delaware, because we really want to get that, you know, this incredibly important moment in American history explained better, make it clear to people, and that's one of the, you know, the Leutz's painting is almost a victim of its own success. It's become so well known that everybody thinks they know it, but almost everybody I've spoken to about that painting has no idea that it was done in Germany. And why Leutze was just the perfect guy to do it. So getting that story out as sort of I think it's an ideal way, and with the upcoming anniversary, an ideal opportunity to reinforce so many of these great stories, but the German contribution to American culture. I mean, what clearer example could there be? Yes, if anyone is interested in supporting, I would say please get in touch with the German American Historical Foundation, and because we want to see this come to life and be shown for everybody.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So.
And just to mention it again, the country, the nation will celebrate its 250th birthday, and the activities are already in the works, so to speak, but the culmination will be in 2026, the actual 250th anniversary or birthday year. And it would be wonderful if we could get this rolled out before, and I'd love to do a showing at the museum as well.
Oh, of course.
If that's possible. And you will be able to find a description of Paul's work, a brief bio, as well as hyperlinks to his website and to the America 250 Commission and to the German American Heritage Foundation and Museum in the YouTube description. The video will be on GHF's YouTube channel and also on our website. Paul, thank you so very much for taking the time to speak with me today. It was a pleasure having you at the museum last week and then having a chance to listen to you again and to really dive into this fascinating subject today, a week later. I'm very grateful that you took the time to do this, to speak with me. Thank you so much, and until next time.
Until next time. Very good. Thank you.